Hello and welcome to our Myths and Politics interview following today's seminar. Our speaker this week was Maria Pretzler, who is an associate professor of ancient history here at Swansea University. And could you tell us a little bit about your talk?
Thanks, Thomas. So today I was talking about the ways in which the Peloponnesian League may have used myths to find the sort of unifying narrative among its allies. And the outcome is, in a way, negative, because I don't think there is much of a chance to do that, particularly because the ethnic identities of the different groups within the Peloponnesian League are fairly strongly defined by the time the alliance is formed. And more importantly, probably, is that in the 5th century, various regions in the Peloponnese started to work together as regions, and their regional identities were further strengthened. My main example are the Akkadians for this, but one can also see it in Elis particularly. And so you have many stories about these identities. And I actually think that Herodotus' stories about the formation of the Peloponnesian League are really problematic. If you look at these myths that he's telling, particularly the story of the bones of Orestes as a sort of starting point for the League, if one looks at this story, it makes no sense in its context in all sorts of ways. So I really sat down with this and tried to figure out what to do with it. And I think the answer is basically that we have to get rid of it. It really doesn't fit into this. However, if you imagine the Tegeans telling this story about why they're allies of Sparta, say in the mid-5th century when they were quite hostile to Sparta, and nevertheless an ally, when you look at that kind of context, then the story starts making sense. And I think there are quite a few of these aspects of the narrative of Herodotus which fit into its 5th century context, and he's not quite getting the 6th century right. And so if we want to understand what the Peloponnese was like in the 6th century, I think we have to do some heavy reconstruction work to work around Herodotus. So in a way, I think that's the outcome of this particular talk. And another thing I was trying to do in this talk is really to think a bit more theoretically about how far manipulation of myth for political for political ends is actually working. What we can actually do. I mean, how far could you just go in and tell people your ancestry now is different from what you grew up with? And I actually think that in modern scholarship, we often, and that includes me in the past, I think we often take this far too lightly. If we overestimate how easy this is. I actually think, particularly in a landscape like the Peloponnese, with its long traditions, it was quite hard to make these changes. And this is one of the reasons why the Peloponnesian League doesn't have a unifying myth. It just couldn't be done in a way.
Yeah, thank you for a good answer. Can you tell us a little bit about your general field of research as well?
Well, this whole talk fits into, well, a long series of studies I've done, partly on the Peloponnese, but also on Pausanias and the traditions in Pausanias. Now, he's, of course, much later than the kind of time I'm looking at in this particular paper, but nevertheless, he's really important for studying myths, even if one has to be really careful with him as an author and always remember the time span. So I've done a lot of work on Pausanias before, but at the moment I'm working on a book on the Peloponnesian League, really trying to find out particularly what impact the Spartan alliance had on the many member states and how they saw it, but also how the members, the allies, influenced the way the League was developing and how it could function in a war, for example, but also how it functioned as a political instrument for Sparta, or possibly even sometimes against Sparta. So this is really a kind of political and cultural history of the Peloponnese from the 6th century down to the 4th. And so thinking about the mythology that underpins some of these relationships is, of course, really important. So this paper was, in a way, proposed to make me think about some of these questions. Some of them I've revisited because I've looked at some of these questions before, but certainly particularly the foundation story of the Peloponnesian League, that was really something I've looked at more intensively this time around. And I actually think it's led me to come up with a new interpretation of that. I think in my book on the League, I'll be absolutely radical in not following Herodotus and his foundation story and try and find an alternative interpretation.
Thank you very much. We look forward to reading your book once that comes out. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much. You too.